Welcome. This is Jeff Harris of the Broadway Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky's Truth Seekers class with a presentation of today's lesson. Today's lesson completes the series When Emotions Rise and is titled Weathering the Blues. It's found in Psalms chapter 31, verses 1 through 8. Although verses 9 and 10 of Psalms chapter 31 are not part of the lesson, they give you a sense of the writer's desperation. See if you can hear it. See if you can feel it. Be gracious to me, Lord, because I am in distress. My eyes are worn out from frustration, my whole being as well. Indeed, my life is consumed with grief, and my ears with groaning. My strength has failed because of my iniquity. Did you feel his distress there? What problems in life or concerns weigh you down emotionally? With some, depression comes from within and is physical. Others have suffered the loss of loved ones. Others have problems with their children, like drug use. Some have lost their jobs and have no prospects. There are those even burdened by political issues. A very real issue are the sports blues in some places. Do you bring your concerns to the Lord? Psalms 31 is most likely a psalm of David. Some have said Jeremiah. Regardless of who it was, the writer was overwhelmed. Psalms 31 begins in verse 1 by saying, "In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust or seek refuge. Let me never be ashamed or disgraced. Deliver me in your righteousness. Bow down your ear to me. Deliver me speedily. Be thou my strong rock for an house of defense to save me." In verse 1, it says, I put my trust or I seek refuge in God. In Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 27, it says, the eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms, and he shall thrust out the enemy from before thee, and shall say, destroy them. This is an image of the cities of refuge, and that's what our God is. In verse 1, when he says, let me never be ashamed or disgraced, he's not saying that God would make him to be ashamed or disgraced. He wants God to help him to not be ashamed or disgraced of himself. In verse 1, it concludes by saying, deliver me in thy righteousness. This righteousness that he's talking about is very similar to the righteousness that God displayed during the Exodus from Egypt. In verse 2, he says, deliver me speedily or quickly. In other words, he wants to be rescued now, as soon as possible. In verse 2, he also says, be my strong rock, or a house of defense to save me. A house of defense could also be called a fortress. God is a mighty fortress. If David is the writer, David hid in the rocks and felt safe. He actually hid in a crevice in a mountain that could be used as a mountain fortress. And so this is the images he has of God. In verses 1 and 2, we find that problems and concerns can weigh us down emotionally. So when this occurs, we need to take our concerns to God, as it will say in verses 3 and 4. Take it to the Lord, verses 3 and 4, for thou art my rock and my fortress. Therefore, for thy name's sake, lead me and guide me. Pull me out of the net that they have laid privily for me, for thou art my strength. The writer starts out in verse 3 saying, for thou art my rock and my fortress. He's repeating what he said before about God being his rock and fortress. Repeating like this suggests high emotions. In verse 3, he says, you are my rock and fortress. Therefore, for your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Notice he didn't say, help me for my sake. He said, I want to do it for your name's sake. Bring honor to God instead of any other reason that you want God's help. He says in verse 4, to pull me out of the net that they have laid privily for me. He said he felt like people had set a net for him, a bird trap. And here's an image of what a bird would have felt like in a trap. And sometimes we feel like that as well. We all know that the Lord is strong, and in the end, he will rescue us to heaven. But while on earth, we sometimes waver. Why? Could it be that heaven often seems to be far away? In verses 1 and 2, it says problems weigh us down emotionally sometimes. So verses 3 and 4 say we should take our cares to the Lord. And after that, verses 5 through 8 say we need to trust God to carry us through. Verse 5, into thine hand I commit my spirit. Thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth. Verse 6, I have hated them that regard lying vanities, but I trust in the Lord. Verse 7, I will be glad and rejoice in your mercy, for thou hast considered my trouble. Thou hast known my soul in adversities. Verse 8, and hast not shut me up into the hand of the enemy. Thou hast set my feet in a large room. In verse 5, do the words, into thine hand I commit my spirit, sound familiar to you? They should. These were the words that Jesus quoted while hanging on the cross in Luke chapter 23, verse 46. Jesus, by quoting this, helps us understand the meaning and the power of this verse. Verse 5 ends by saying, you have redeemed me, O Lord. Redeemed means to be bought back, just like in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, where Boaz became Ruth's kinsman redeemer and bought back the land for her mother-in-law. In the same manner, Jesus redeems our souls back to God. In verse 6, the writer says, I have hated them that regard lying vanities. In other words, he hates those who worship idols. Rather than choosing a worthless, worldly, idolatrous life, we should trust in God. In verse 7, the writer says, I will rejoice. He's saying, I will be exceedingly happy because you know what troubles me. I will rejoice because you have not given me into the hands of the enemy, he says in verse 7. He's saying he will rejoice because he's been given freedom. In verses 5 through 8, the writer is saying, trust God to carry you through, and you can then rejoice. You can then be happy in all things. So what can we do when we are blue? Do you bring your concerns to the Lord? How has God lifted you up when you have? How do you respond when you are overwhelmed with the blues? Psalms 31 ends by saying, I am ridiculed by all my adversaries, and even by my neighbors. I'm dreaded by my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street run from me. I am forgotten, gone from memory, like a dead person, like broken pottery. I have heard the gossip of many. Terror is on every side. When they conspired against me, they plotted to take my life. But I trust in you, Lord, I say. You are my God. But those who are not born again, those whose Lord is not Jesus, have nowhere to go to get this kind of comfort. Thank you. This concludes the lesson.